The October morning in Baltimore brought with it the characteristic cutting cold of autumn, with golden leaves dancing on the damp sidewalks of West Baltimore Street. Gervonta Davis walked with determined steps, wearing a discreet gray hoodie and sunglasses that barely managed to hide his identity from the most attentive fans. He had just left a meeting with his managers downtown, where they discussed the details of his next fight, scheduled for December at the Barclays Center. The lightweight world champion decided to walk to where his driver was waiting, 3 blocks ahead. It was one of those rare mornings when he preferred to feel the real pulse of the city that had watched him grow up, away from the spotlights and cameras that constantly followed him. The memories of his childhood on those same streets still echoed in his mind. The difficult days when an empty refrigerator was a constant reality, and the sound of gunshots punctuated hopeless nights. That's when something caught his attention near an abandoned convenience store. A man was sitting on the ground, leaning against a graffitied wall, with torn cardboard that read with difficulty, "Veteran, any help? God bless." What made Gervonta stop wasn't the request itself, but something familiar in that man's hunched posture, in the way his broad shoulders contracted against the cold. The boxer approached slowly, his heart beginning to race with a suspicion he didn't want to confirm. When he was just a few meters away, the man lifted his face, and their eyes met. The shock was mutual and instantaneous. There, sitting on the dirty ground of Baltimore, was Marcus "Thunder" Thornton, the man who 5 years earlier had shared the ring with him in one of the most brutal fights of his career. The transformation was shocking. The face that once displayed the arrogant confidence of an undefeated challenger now showed the deep marks of time and hardship. The eyes that sparkled with competitive fury in the ring now carried the weight of 1,000 defeats outside it. Marcus tried to stand up, but his legs trembled, revealing a fragility that Gervonta would never have imagined seeing in one who had been among his toughest opponents. Gervonta's mind instantly returned to that May night in 2019, at the MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas. Marcus Thornton had come to that fight with an impressive record of 28 wins and no losses, being considered by many experts as the toughest test of Davis's career up to that point. The press had created an explosive narrative. The prodigy kid from Baltimore against the destroyer from Detroit, 2 fighters with stories of overcoming, but only one would leave with the belt. The fight had been a 12-round war that tested every fiber of both fighters' beings. Marcus had knocked down Gervonta in the 4th round with a devastating left hook that made the entire audience hold their breath. It was the first time Davis had touched the canvas in his professional career, and the moment had been replayed endlessly in sports highlights. But Gervonta got up, spat blood, and returned to battle with a determination that surprised even Calvin Ford, his veteran trainer. What followed were 8 rounds of pure high-level boxing, with both fighters trading blows that would have knocked out lesser men. In the 11th round, when Marcus was already showing signs of fatigue, Gervonta connected with a perfect combination. Jab, straight right, uppercut. The sound of the impact echoed throughout the arena, and Marcus fell like a centuries-old tree being felled. He tried to get up, his eyes showing the same determination that Gervonta had demonstrated rounds before, but his legs wouldn't obey. After the fight, in the locker room, Gervonta had heard from the doctors that Marcus had suffered a severe concussion. But at the press conference, Thornton appeared smiling, promising to come back stronger. They had embraced backstage, 2 warriors who had shared something that only those who bleed together in the ring can understand. Marcus had said he would return, that this defeat was just a chapter in his story. Now, looking at the broken man before him, Gervonta wondered what other chapters had been written in Marcus Thornton's life. The contrast between the fierce fighter of that night and the helpless man before him was so great that it seemed impossible to reconcile the 2 images. But the same fists that once threatened his reign now trembled holding an empty coffee cup. Gervonta slowly crouched down, removing his sunglasses and meeting Marcus's eyes directly. The recognition on the former fighter's face was followed by a complex mixture of emotions: shame, surprise, and something that seemed like relief. Marcus tried to speak, but the words seemed stuck in his throat, like punches that couldn't get past the guard. The silence between them was heavy, loaded with the weight of destinies that had taken drastically different paths. Sitting down next to Marcus on the cold ground, ignoring the curious looks from passers-by, Gervonta waited. He had learned from Calvin Ford that sometimes silence was more powerful than words, especially when it came to proud men who had fallen. Gradually, like a dam breaking, Marcus began to tell his story, his hoarse voice cutting through the cold Baltimore morning air. After the loss to Gervonta, Marcus had tried to recover and return to the top, but the concussion had been more serious than initially diagnosed. He began having memory problems, debilitating headaches, and dizzy spells that made it impossible to train properly. He fought 3 more times, losing each one in increasingly devastating fashion. His manager, Donovan Hayes, abandoned him after the 3rd consecutive defeat, taking with him much of the money Marcus had accumulated. The downward spiral was quick and merciless. Unable to fight and with mounting medical expenses, Marcus began gambling, believing his boxing knowledge would give him an edge. He lost his house in Detroit, his luxury car, and eventually his family. His wife, Vanessa, had tried to help him, but when he started drinking to relieve the physical and emotional pain, she took the children and left. For 2 years, he had been living on the streets, moving from city to city, fleeing from memories and debts. Baltimore had been his last stop, ironically. He had come to Gervonta's hometown without knowing exactly why, perhaps looking for some kind of closure or understanding. He had gotten some temporary construction jobs, but the neurological problems made it difficult to keep any employment. Now, with winter approaching and no prospects, he had accepted that perhaps this was his fate, to die on the streets of the city of the man who had effectively ended his career. Gervonta felt every word from Marcus like direct blows to his own chest. He knew all too well the thin line between success and failure in the boxing world, had seen many gym companions follow similar paths. The difference between him and Marcus wasn't talent or determination. Both had possessed that in abundance. It was a combination of luck, timing, and mainly, having the right people around at crucial moments. Without saying a word, Gervonta took out his phone and made a quick call to his driver, cancelling the ride. Next, he called Leonard Ellaby, his manager, postponing the afternoon meeting. Marcus watched with a mixture of confusion and cautious hope, not knowing exactly what was happening. When Gervonta put away his phone, he stood up and extended his hand to his former opponent. Marcus's hesitation was palpable. Pride, even shattered, still existed. Accepting help from the man who had defeated him was admitting an even greater defeat than the one in the ring. But when his eyes met Gervonta's again, he saw something he didn't expect. Not pity or superiority, but genuine understanding. It was the look of someone who had been too close to the abyss to judge those who had fallen into it. Helping Marcus to his feet, Gervonta noticed how the once powerful body had deteriorated. The muscles that once seemed sculpted in granite now hung flaccid, and there was a constant tremor in his hands that spoke of untreated neurological damage. But in Marcus's eyes, behind all the pain and humiliation, there was still a glimmer of the fighter he had been. That indomitable spark that separates true warriors from pretenders. Walking together through the streets of Baltimore, Gervonta guided Marcus to a small family restaurant he had known since childhood. The owner, Raymond, was an old family friend who had fed Gervonta many times when he didn't have a penny in his pocket. Now it was his turn to pass on this kindness. While Marcus devoured his first hot meal in days, Gervonta made calls, activating a network of contacts he had built over the years. In the following weeks, Gervonta worked quietly behind the scenes to help Marcus rebuild his life. First, he got him admitted to a clinic specializing in sports-related traumatic brain injuries, where he could receive the proper treatment that had been denied due to lack of resources. Dr. William Chen, a renowned neurologist who had treated several professional athletes, agreed to evaluate Marcus without initial costs after a conversation with Gervonta. The diagnosis was serious, but not without hope. Marcus suffered from early-stage chronic traumatic encephalopathy, along with a series of other neurological complications resulting from years of punishment in the ring. With proper treatment, medication, and therapy, many of the symptoms could be controlled. But the path would be long and difficult, requiring not just financial resources, but also willpower and constant support. Gervonta also worked to resolve Marcus's housing situation. Through contacts in the boxing world, he discovered that James Morrison, a former fighter who had made a successful transition to business, owned a small apartment complex in Baltimore intended for athletes in transition. Morrison, touched by the story and Gervonta's intervention, offered Marcus a modest apartment with symbolic rent until he could get back on his feet. But perhaps the most important part of the process was reconnecting Marcus with his family. Gervonta discovered that Vanessa and the children, Marcus Jr., 12, and Aaliyah, 9, were living with her mother in Philadelphia. With delicacy and patience, he facilitated initial phone conversations, assuring Vanessa that Marcus was receiving professional help and making real progress. The first video call between Marcus and his children, after 2 years of silence, was a moment that left even tough Gervonta with teary eyes. In parallel, Gervonta used his influence to get Marcus a job as an assistant trainer at a local community gym. It wasn't much, but it gave him purpose and a modest income. Seeing Marcus teaching young fighters the fundamentals of boxing, sharing his hard-won experience and knowledge, brought back some of the dignity he had lost. The youngsters didn't know they were learning from someone who had been just a few punches away from being a world champion. 3 months after that fateful street encounter, Marcus's transformation was remarkable, though still fragile. Medical treatment had stabilized many of his neurological symptoms, and sobriety had returned clarity to his mind. He had gained healthy weight, his eyes had regained some sparkle, and there were moments when the old Marcus "Thunder" Thornton could be glimpsed again. But the journey was far from over, and both men knew it. One night, after a particularly intense session at the gym where Marcus had helped prepare a young fighter for his first amateur fight, he and Gervonta sat on the steps outside. The conversation flowed into territories they had avoided until then. The night of the fight, what had gone wrong, and what could have been different. Marcus admitted he had underestimated Gervonta, letting pride cloud his judgment and preparation. Gervonta, in turn, confessed that fight had been a turning point in his career. Seeing Marcus get up after that knockdown in the 4th round had shown him the true meaning of courage. He had fought many times since then, but no victory had taught him as much as that war with Marcus. It was ironic, he observed, that the man who had helped mold him as a champion had ended up needing his help to survive. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar car. Vanessa got out with the children for their weekly visit, a routine that had been established after Marcus proved his dedication to recovery. Marcus Jr. ran to hug his father, while Aaliyah remained more reserved, still processing the years of absence. Gervonta prepared to leave, but Marcus held him back, insisting he stay for family dinner. During the simple meal in the small apartment, Gervonta observed the family dynamic slowly rebuilding. There were tense moments, uncomfortable silences, but also genuine laughter and glimpses of what they had been and could be again. When Marcus Jr. discovered that Gervonta Davis was having dinner with them, his eyes widened with admiration. The boy bombarded the champion with questions about boxing, and Gervonta answered patiently, subtly including stories about his father's greatness in the ring. As winter gave way to spring, the story of Marcus's redemption had spread quietly through the boxing community. Not through sensational headlines or social media posts, Gervonta had ensured discretion, but through whispered conversations in gyms and trainer meetings. What surprised many wasn't just Marcus's fall, something unfortunately common in the sport, but Gervonta's unsolicited and sustained response. Calvin Ford, Gervonta's legendary trainer, observed everything with silent approval. He had taught his pupil to fight inside the ring, but seeing Gervonta demonstrate such compassion and maturity outside, it was the true victory. During a training session, Ford commented that the real test of a champion wasn't how many opponents he knocked down, but how many he helped get up. Marcus, for his part, had found new purpose in his second chance. Beyond his work at the gym, he began speaking at local schools about the dangers of brain injuries in sports and the importance of having plans beyond boxing. His brutal honesty about his fall resonated with young athletes who often saw only the glory and not the risks. He didn't discourage boxing, but preached preparation, education, and above all, humility. The relationship between Marcus and Gervonta had evolved into something unique. They weren't exactly friends in the traditional sense. There was too much history and complexity for that. But there was deep mutual respect and an understanding that transcended words. They occasionally trained together, with Marcus offering technical insights that only someone who had studied Gervonta intensely could provide. On a particularly significant afternoon, Marcus received a call that left him in tears. A second chance program for former athletes, impressed by his story and transformation, had offered him a full scholarship to study sports physical therapy. It was an opportunity to build a sustainable career using his knowledge of the human body and sports, but this time helping to heal rather than hurt. When he shared the news with Gervonta, both men understood that the circle was beginning to close. 1 year after that encounter on the streets of Baltimore, Gervonta was preparing for another title defense. The fight would be in his hometown, at the Royal Farms Arena, and the anticipation was electric. During fight week, amid all the media obligations and preparation, Gervonta made sure to have Marcus as part of his preparation team, not officially, but as a consultant and friend. At the final press conference, a reporter asked Gervonta about Marcus Thornton's presence in his training camp, clearly looking for a sensational story. Gervonta paused, choosing his words carefully. He spoke about respect between warriors, about how boxing was a brotherhood that went beyond wins and losses, and about how sometimes the greatest opponents could teach the greatest lessons. He didn't go into details about Marcus's situation, protecting the dignity of the man he had helped rebuild. On fight night, Marcus was in the front row with his reunited family. Vanessa had agreed to give the marriage another chance, and the children proudly wore Gervonta shirts. When the champion made his entrance, his eyes met Marcus's for a brief moment. The almost imperceptible nod between them carried the weight of a shared journey that few could understand. The fight itself was a masterful display by Gervonta, ending with a knockout in the 7th round. But the most powerful moment came afterward, during the in-ring interview. When asked about his motivation, Gervonta looked directly at where Marcus was sitting, and simply said he fought not just for belts, but for the ability to make a difference. That true power wasn't in the fists, but in what you did with the influence those fists gave you. Later that night, away from the cameras and spotlights, Gervonta and Marcus met backstage. There was no need for grand speeches or dramatic gestures. Marcus simply extended his hand, and when Gervonta shook it, both understood they had completed a journey that had begun with violence in the ring, but had ended with redemption on the streets of Baltimore. Marcus had his life back, his family, his dignity, and a future. Gervonta had something even more valuable: confirmation that his greatness wouldn't be measured just in titles defended, but in lives transformed. In the city that had forged both men, they had discovered that sometimes the greatest champions are those who help others get up when they fall. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.